Helen Jenkins emptied her apron pocket, staring at the crumpled $5 bill that stood between her and her daughter's asthma medication. She never expected that parting with her last few dollars to feed a stranded biker would turn her quiet Tuesday shift into a roaring standoff with 150 Hells Angels. The air conditioning unit inside the Copper Skillet diner had been broken since early July, leaving the air thick with the suffocating scent of frying grease, burnt filter coffee, and Texas highway dust. It was Tuesday, August 14th, the kind of oppressive, blindingly hot afternoon where the asphalt outside looked like black water. Helen Jenkins leaned against the laminate counter, a damp rag clutched in her pale hands. She was 28 but looked older, the exhaustion carved into the fine lines around her eyes. Her shift had started at 6 in the morning, and the tips in her apron currently amounted to exactly $7.45. It wasn't enough. Her 5-year-old daughter, Chloe, needed a refill on her albuterol inhaler by tomorrow, and the pharmacy in town didn't take promises. Behind the grill stood Bob Henderson, the diner's owner. Bob was a barrel-chested man with a perpetually flushed face and a temper that flared faster than a grease fire. He ran the Copper Skillet with an iron fist and a deep-seated suspicion of anyone who didn't live within a 10-mile radius of the diner. The bell above the glass door chimed, shattering the lazy afternoon silence. The man who walked in seemed to swallow all the light in the room. He was towering, easily 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block the doorway. He wore heavy, scuffed leather boots, faded denim, and a thick leather vest adorned with the unmistakable winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. A jagged, faded scar ran from his left earlobe down to his collarbone, disappearing beneath a tangled, silver-streaked beard. Old Mr. Higgins, nursing a lukewarm tea in booth 3, suddenly found his crossword puzzle intensely fascinating. The two truckers at the counter stopped their quiet murmuring. The tension in the room spiked, tight and vibrating like a guitar string about to snap. Helen swallowed hard, wiping her hands on her apron, and stepped forward. "Afternoon," she said, her voice trembling slightly before she forced it steady. "Just you, sir?" The biker looked down at her. His eyes were a startling, pale grey, sharp and entirely unreadable. "Yeah," he rumbled, his voice sounding like tires on gravel. "Just me. Booth in the back." He walked past her, the heavy scent of motor oil, stale tobacco, and sweat trailing behind him. He slid into the darkest corner of the diner, his back to the wall, eyes scanning the exits. Helen grabbed a laminated menu and a glass of ice water, approaching his table with measured steps. "What can I get for you?" "Coffee, black, and whatever the biggest plate of food you have is," he said, not looking at the menu. "That'd be the meatloaf special, sir. Comes with mashed potatoes, green beans, and a slice of cherry pie. Bring it." For the next 20 minutes, the diner remained locked in a strained silence. Bob glared daggers at the back of the biker's head from the grill, muttering under his breath about thugs and trouble. Helen simply poured coffee, noting how the massive man ate with a methodical, almost desperate speed, as if he hadn't seen a hot meal in days. When the plate was scraped clean, Helen walked over with the check. "That'll be $12.50, sir." The biker reached into his back pocket. His hand stopped. A flicker of confusion crossed his weathered face, quickly replaced by a hardening of his jaw. He patted his front pockets. He checked the inner lining of his leather cut. Nothing. He looked up at Helen, and for a fraction of a second, the intimidating aura fractured. He just looked tired. "I lost my wallet," he said flatly. "Must have rattled out of my saddlebag 100 miles back." From across the diner, Bob Henderson's ears perked up. He wiped his greasy hands on a towel and marched out from behind the counter, his face turning an angry, mottled purple. Lost your wallet, huh? Bob sneered, loud enough for the whole diner to hear. That's the oldest trick in the damn book. You bikers think you can just roll into my town, eat my food, and intimidate us into a free meal. The biker slowly stood up. He dwarfed Bob completely. I ain't looking for trouble, old man. I rode up from El Paso. I lost my leather. I'll leave my watch as collateral. Ride into town. Make a call. And bring your money back. He unclasped a heavy, silver watch from his thick wrist and set it on the table. Bob scoffed, his hand drifting dangerously toward the space beneath the cash register, where Helen knew he kept a loaded Remington 870 shotgun. I don't want your stolen jewelry. I want my $12.50, or I'm calling the county sheriff right now. We'll see how you like the holding cell. The biker's fists clenched. The pale grey eyes went ice cold. The atmosphere in the diner turned volatile. Helen could see the muscles in the man's massive arms tensing. A brawl in the diner would destroy the place, and Bob reaching for that shotgun would end in bloodshed. "Stop!" Helen shouted, her voice cracking like a whip. Both men looked at her. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the familiar, worn paper of her meager tips. It was the money for Chloe's medicine. If she gave it up, she didn't know how she would face the pharmacist tomorrow. But looking at the biker's scarred face, she saw something beneath the terrifying exterior, a rigid, desperate pride. And looking at Bob, she saw a tragedy waiting to happen. She pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, 2 ones, and a handful of quarters, slapping them down onto the Formica table. "The bill is paid, Bob," Helen said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I'm covering it." Bob stared at the money, then at Helen, his jaw dropping. "Are you out of your mind, Jenkins? You're paying for this vagrant?" "I said it's covered," Helen repeated, turning her back to her boss and looking directly at the biker. "You're good to go, sir." The biker looked down at the pile of crumpled bills and tarnished coins. He knew what a waitress in a dive diner made. He knew what that money meant. Slowly he picked up his silver watch and strapped it back onto his wrist. He looked at Helen, holding her gaze for a long, heavy moment. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked quietly. "Helen," she whispered. "Helen," he repeated, committing it to memory. He gave a sharp, single nod. "I'm Arthur. They call me Deacon. I don't forget a favor." Without another word to Bob, Deacon turned on his heel and strode out of the diner. A moment later, the deafening roar of a modified Harley-Davidson engine rattled the glass windows, fading slowly into the relentless heat of the Texas afternoon. "You are an absolute certified idiot," Bob hissed, snatching the money off the table and shoving it into his pocket. "You think he's coming back? You think a Hell's Angel cares about a waitress at the copper skillet? You just threw away your own hard-earned cash for a criminal." Helen didn't answer. She picked up the empty plates, her hands trembling so badly the silverware clattered against the ceramic. A sickening knot of regret tightened in her stomach. Bob was right. She was an idiot. She had let her fear of a violent confrontation override her survival instincts. How was she going to get Chloe's inhaler now? She'd have to beg her landlord for an extension on the rent, maybe sell the silver locket her mother left her. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. There was no time to cry. The dinner rush was coming. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The sweltering afternoon bled into early evening. The sky above the Texas plains bruised into shades of violent purple and dark crimson as the sun began its descent. By 6 o'clock, the diner was packed with the usual Tuesday crowd, ranch hands, tired commuters, and a few local families. Helen was moving on autopilot, balancing trays of chicken-fried steak and refilling iced teas. Her mind was 1,000,000 miles away, calculating pennies, terrified of the morning. At 6:45 p.m., the change began. It didn't start with a sound, but with a feeling. A low, rhythmic vibration crept through the soles of Helen's worn-out sneakers. It felt like a small earthquake. On the counter, half-empty glasses of water began to ripple. The silverware vibrated against the tables. Conversations in the diner slowly died out. People looked around, confused. "Train coming off the tracks?" one of the ranch hands muttered, peering out the grease-stained window. Then came the sound. It was a distant, mechanical thunder, a low, guttural roar that grew steadily louder, drowning out the hum of the broken air conditioner and the sizzle of the grill. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets, magnified 1,000 times. Helen stopped pouring coffee for Mrs. Gable at booth 2. She looked toward the highway. Over the crest of the asphalt hill, about a half-mile down the road, a headlight appeared. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the highway was a solid wall of blinding halogen lights and gleaming chrome. It wasn't just a few motorcycles. It was a mechanical army. They rode in tight, disciplined formation, taking up both lanes of the highway. The noise was apocalyptic, shaking the very foundations of the small diner. Panic erupted inside the copper skillet. "Lord Almighty," Mrs. Gable gasped, clutching her purse to her chest. People abandoned their meals, rushing away from the windows. The sheer scale of the convoy was terrifying. As the leaders of the pack signaled, the monstrous procession began to slow down, turning off the highway and crunching onto the massive gravel parking lot of the diner. Dozens upon dozens of heavy cruisers and customized choppers poured in. They circled the building like a wagon train preparing for a siege, cutting off every exit. The dust kicked up by their tires formed a thick, brown cloud around the diner, illuminated by the harsh glare of their headlights. Helen stood frozen in the center of the aisle. Her breath hitched. She counted 30, then 50, then stopped counting when she realized there had to be well over 100 of them. Maybe 150. They all wore the same heavy leather vests. The Hell's Angels. "Lock the doors!" Bob screamed from behind the counter, his previous bravado entirely evaporated. He was pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. "Somebody lock the damn doors!" But nobody moved. They were all paralyzed by the spectacle outside. The roaring engines suddenly cut out, not all at once, but in rolling waves, until the deafening noise was replaced by the terrifying sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel. The dust began to settle. Through the front window, Helen watched as the riders dismounted. They were a terrifying assortment of men, massive, bearded, tattooed, and clad in heavy denim and leather chains. They moved with a chilling, organized purpose, gathering in the center of the parking lot. From the center of the pack, a figure stepped forward. It was Deacon. He had changed his shirt, but he wore the same scarred scowl. However, he wasn't leading the pack. Beside him walked a man who commanded immediate, terrifying respect. This man was older, his face weathered like ancient mahogany, his silver hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. He carried a heavy, silver-tipped walking stick, though he didn't seem to need it. On the breast of his cut, above the death's head, was a patch that simply read, "President." The president and Deacon broke away from the massive crowd of bikers, walking slowly and deliberately toward the front entrance of the copper skillet. The remaining 150 men stood behind them in utter, intimidating silence, a wall of leather and muscle. Inside, a woman let out a stifled sob. Bob had actually crouched down behind the grill, completely out of sight. Helen's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He brought them back, she thought, panic rising in her throat like bile. Bob insulted him, threatened him with a gun, and now he's brought the entire chapter back to burn this place to the ground. The president stepped up to the glass door. He didn't knock. He simply grabbed the metal handle. The bell above the door chimed, a weak, pathetic little sound that echoed through the dead-silent diner as the heavy glass door swung open. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind them, sealing the sweltering diner off from the roar of the idling highway. William Iron Will Callahan, the president of the local Hells Angels charter, stood just inside the threshold. He did not look like a man who had come for a casual dinner. His eyes, the color of crushed slate, swept methodically over the terrified patrons, lingering on the cowering ranch hands and the empty space behind the counter where Bob Henderson had ducked for cover. Beside him, Arthur Deacon Rossi stood like a stone sentinel, his massive arms crossed over his leather-clad chest. The air in the copper skillet was so thick with fear that Helen felt she could choke on it. The only sound was the frantic, uneven hum of the broken air-conditioning unit and the faint whimpering of Mrs. Gable in booth 2. Callahan took a slow, deliberate step forward. His heavy engineer boots thudded against the checkered linoleum floor. He stopped right in front of the counter, planting his silver-tipped walking stick firmly between his feet. "I'm looking for the owner of this establishment." Callahan's voice boomed. It wasn't a shout, but a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the room. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Behind the grill, a pathetic scrambling sound echoed. Bob Henderson slowly elevated his head above the stainless steel counter, his face drained of all color, slick with cold sweat. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad. I'm the owner," Bob stammered, his voice cracking violently. "Listen, whatever he told you, it was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any disrespect. Take whatever you want from the register, just please don't hurt anybody." Callahan didn't even blink. He looked at Bob with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. A man who cowers behind his grease traps while a young woman faces the front door ain't worth the breath it takes to threaten him. Keep your dirty money, cook. Callahan turned his gaze away from the trembling owner and locked eyes with Helen. The intense scrutiny made her knees feel weak, but she anchored her hands to the edge of the Formica counter, refusing to step back. She was terrified, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. But the thought of her daughter, Chloe, gave her a sudden, desperate anchor of bravery. "You're Helen," Callahan stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Helen replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Deacon tells me you bought his lunch today," the president continued, gesturing slightly to the giant man beside him. "Tells me you covered his tab when he realized he'd lost his cut and his cash on the interstate." "I did." "Why?" Callahan tilted his head, his slate-gray eyes narrowing. "You don't look like a woman drowning in disposable income, sweetheart. And my brother here ain't exactly the poster boy for charity cases. So why'd you do it? Were you scared he was going to tear this place apart?" Helen swallowed hard. She glanced at Deacon, whose expression remained entirely unreadable, then looked back at Callahan. She decided the only thing left to do was tell the absolute truth. "I was scared your friend and my boss were going to kill each other over $12.50, Helen said, her voice echoing clearly in the silent diner. "My boss keeps a loaded Remington under the register. Your friend looked like he could snap Bob's neck before he even chambered a round. I have a 5-year-old daughter who needs her asthma medication tomorrow morning. If the police came, or if this place got shut down because of a bloodbath, I lose my job. I lose her medicine. $12 was all I had. but it was cheaper than the alternative. The silence that followed her confession was absolute. Bob let out a strangled gasp, horrified that she had mentioned the hidden shotgun. The patrons held their breath. Callahan stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on the room. Then, incredibly, the corners of the president's weathered mouth twitched upward. A low, rumbling chuckle erupted from his chest, echoing loudly in the diner. Beside him, Deacon's rigid posture relaxed, and a genuine, warm smile cracked across his scarred face. "Pragmatic," Callahan said, nodding with deep respect. "I like that. You got grit, Helen. But out on the road, a debt is a debt. Deacon ate your food on your dime. The Hell's Angels do not take handouts, and we sure as hell don't let a hard-working mother sacrifice her kid's medicine for one of our own." Callahan raised his walking stick and slammed it hard against the floorboard. The sharp crack made everyone in the room jump. Instantly, the heavy glass door swung open, and the sea of leather-clad men waiting outside began to pour into the copper skillet. They filed in by the dozens, massive men with road-weary faces, covered in oil, dust, and tattoos. The diner, designed to seat 40 people comfortably, was immediately overrun. They squeezed into the booths, 4 or 5 to a side. They lined the diner counter, shoulder to shoulder. When the seats ran out, they sat cross-legged on the linoleum floor, leaned against the jukebox, and crowded the aisles until there was barely room to breathe. What are you doing?" Bob squeaked from behind the counter, his eyes wide with horror, as his diner was completely occupied by the motorcycle club. Callahan leaned over the counter, grinning fiercely at the terrified cook. "Well, Bob, you run a diner, don't you? My boys have been riding since sunrise. We're hungry." Callahan pulled a thick, leather-bound wad of cash from his vest and slammed it onto the counter. 150 meatloaf specials, mashed potatoes, green beans and cherry pie. And keep the black coffee coming until the pots run dry. Bob stared at the money. Then at the 150 intimidating bikers staring expectantly back at him. I don't have enough meatloaf for 150 people. I don't have enough plates." "Then you better start cooking burgers, steaks, eggs, or whatever else you got in that freezer," Deacon rumbled, stepping up to the counter. "And we don't mind eating out of to-go boxes. Get to work, Bob." What followed was the most surreal, chaotic, and exhausting 3 hours of Helen Jenkins's life. The copper skillet transformed from a quiet, dying roadside stop into a roaring, high-octane banquet hall. The bikers, despite their terrifying appearance, were surprisingly polite, though overwhelmingly loud. They swapped roaring stories of the road, played classic rock on the jukebox, and drank coffee by the gallon. Helen moved through the sea of leather and denim like a dancer, balancing towering trays of food. She served plates of hastily thawed steaks, massive stacks of pancakes, and every single hamburger bun in the building. When they ran out of clean forks, the bikers happily ate with their hands. When the ice machine gave out, they drank their water warm. Behind the counter, Bob Henderson was undergoing a baptism by fire. Stripped down to his sweat-stained undershirt, he was frantically flipping burgers and frying potatoes, completely terrified that a single burnt piece of bacon might incite a riot. The bikers occasionally shouted compliments to the chef, which only seemed to confuse and terrify Bob further. By 10 o'clock that night, the copper skillet's industrial fridge was completely empty. The grill was scraped clean, the coffee pots were bone dry, and a thick haze of grease and cigarette smoke hung near the ceiling. Helen leaned against the back counter, her legs trembling with exhaustion, her apron stained with ketchup and gravy. She watched as the bikers slowly began to stand up, stretching their massive frames and adjusting their leather cuts. The meal was over. Callahan approached the counter, tapping his walking stick lightly. Deacon walked right behind him. "Best meal we've had since Albuquerque," Callahan said, his voice cutting through the fading chatter. He looked at Bob, who was slumped against the refrigerator, panting heavily. "You cook a decent burger, Bob. Try not to be such a miserable coward next time a stranger walks through your door." Bob just nodded weakly, too exhausted to muster even a sliver of his usual arrogance. Callahan turned his attention to Helen. The president reached into his heavy leather vest and pulled out an old, beautifully worn leather tobacco pouch. He placed it gently on the counter in front of her. "Deacon owes you $12.50, Callahan said softly, "but the club owes you for keeping one of our founders out of a cage today. We take care of those who take care of us." Helen stared at the pouch. It was bulging, tied shut with a thick leather cord. "Mr. Callahan, I can't take this. I was just doing my job. Your men already paid for the food tonight." "That was for the diner." Deacon stepped forward, his pale grey eyes fixed entirely on her. He reached out with a scarred, calloused hand and pushed the pouch closer to her. "This is for Helen, for the asthma medicine, for the rent, for whatever you and your little girl need to get the hell out of this dead-end town and away from bosses who treat you like dirt." "Open it," Callahan commanded gently. With trembling fingers, Helen untied the leather cord and pulled the flaps back. Inside was a massive, tightly banded stack of cash. Hundreds, 50s, 20s. It wasn't just a tip. It was a small fortune. "Every man in this room threw in $100, Deacon explained, his voice low and raspy. "That's $15,000, Helen. It's clean money, and it's yours. If your boss tries to lay a single greasy finger on a dime of it, he knows exactly who will come back to collect it." Deacon shot a terrifying glare toward the back of the kitchen. Bob Henderson violently shook his head, pressing his hands against the wall as if trying to merge with it. Tears finally broke through Helen's defenses, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. She looked up at the scarred biker, then at the imposing president, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the gesture. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank us." Callahan smiled, turning toward the door. "Just take care of your little girl." With a final nod, Callahan and Deacon walked out of the diner. The rest of the club followed, a thunderous parade of heavy boots and jingling chains heading out into the cool Texas night. A minute later, the roaring symphony of 150 motorcycle engines shattered the quiet darkness. Helen stood at the window, clutching the heavy leather pouch to her chest, watching as the massive column of headlights pulled out onto the highway, disappearing over the horizon like a comet tail of chrome and fire. The diner fell dead silent once more, but the oppressive atmosphere was gone. In her hands, Helen held more than just money. She held the unshakable proof that salvation sometimes wore a scarred face and a leather vest. She looked down at the pouch, wiped her tears and smiled. Tomorrow morning, Chloe was getting her medicine, and Helen was turning in her apron for good. Helen's story stands as a powerful testament to the unpredictability of human nature and the quiet strength of empathy. When she looked past the leather and the scars, she didn't just prevent a tragedy. She sparked a profound chain reaction of gratitude. It reminds us that humanity's deepest bonds often forge in the most unlikely places, proving that genuine kindness is a currency respected by all.